Section 2 of the Basis of Morality.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Basis of Morality by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Arthur Broderick Bullock. Part 2, Chapters 1 and 2. Part 2, Critique of Kant's Basis of Ethics. Chapter 1, Preliminary Remarks. It is Kant's great service to moral science that he purified it of all eudaimonism. With the ancients, ethics was a doctrine of eudaimonism. With the moderns, for the most part, it has been a doctrine of salvation. The former wished to prove that virtue and happiness are identical, but this was like having two figures which never coincide with each other, no matter how they may be placed. The latter have endeavored to connect the two, not by the principle of identity, but by that of causation, thus making happiness the result of virtue. But to do this, they were obliged to have recourse to sophisms, or else to assume the existence of a world beyond any possible perception of the senses. Among the ancients, Plato alone forms an exception. His system is not eudaimonistic, it is mystic instead. Even the ethics of the Cynics and Stoics is nothing but a special form of eudaimonism, to prove which there is no lack of evidence and testimony, but the nature of my present task forbids the space. The ancients then, equally with the moderns, Plato being the single exception, agree in making virtue only a means to an end. Indeed, strictly speaking, even Kant banished eudaimonism from ethics more in appearance than in reality, for between virtue and happiness he still leaves a certain mysterious connection. There is an obscure and difficult passage in his doctrine of the highest good, where they occur together, while it is a patent fact that the course of virtue runs entirely counter to that of happiness. But passing over this, we may say that with Kant the ethical principle appears as something quite independent of experience and its teaching. It is transcendental or metaphysical. He recognizes that human conduct possesses a significance that oversteps all possibility of experience, and is therefore actually the bridge leading to that which he calls the intelligible world, the mundus noumenon, the world of things in themselves. The fame which the Kantian ethics has won is due not only to this higher level which it reached, but also to the moral purity and loftiness of its conclusions. It is by the latter that most people have been attracted, without paying much attention to the foundation, which is propounded in a very complex, abstract, and artificial form, and Kant himself required all his powers of acumen and synthesis to give it an appearance of solidity. Fortunately, he separated his ethics from the exposition of its basis, devoting to the latter a special work entitled the Grundlegung zur Metaphysik der Sitten, the theme of which will be found to be precisely the same as that of our prize essay. For on page 13 of the preface he says, "The present treatise is nothing else but an attempt to find out and establish the supreme principle of morality. This is an investigation whose scope is complete in itself, and which should be kept apart from all other moral researches." It is in this book that we find the basis, that is to say, the essentials of his ethics set forth with an acute penetration and systematic conciseness, as in no other of his writings. It has, moreover, the great advantage of being the first of Kant's moral works, appearing, as it did, only 4 years later than the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, and consequently it dates from the period when, although he was 61, the detrimental effect of old age on his intellect was not yet perceptible. On the other hand, this is distinctly traceable in the Kritik der praktischen Vernunft, which was published in 1788, or 1 year later than the unhappy remodeling of the Kritik der reinen Vernunft in the second edition, whereby the latter, his immortal masterpiece, was obviously marred. An analysis of this question is to be found in the preface to the new edition by Rosenkranz, from which my own investigation makes it impossible for me to dissent. The Kritik der praktischen Vernunft contains in its essentials the same material as the above-mentioned Grundlegung, only the latter has a more concise and rigorous form, while in the former the subject is handled with greater prolixity, interspersed with digressions and even padded with some pieces of moral rhetoric to heighten the impression. When Kant wrote it, he had at last and late in life become deservedly famous. Hence, being certain of boundless attention, he allowed greater play to the garrulity of old age. But the Kritik der praktischen Vernunft contains 2 sections which are peculiar to itself. First, the exposition of the relation between freedom and necessity. This passage is above all praise, and undoubtedly was framed earlier in his life, as it is entirely in harmony with his treatment of the same subject in the Kritik der reinen Vernunft. and secondly, the Moraltheologie, which will more and more come to be recognized as the real object Kant had in view. In his Metaphysische Anfangsgründe der Tugendlehre, this pendant to the deplorable Rechtslehre, written in 1797, the debility of old age is at length fully preponderant. For all these reasons, the present criticism will mainly deal with the treatise first mentioned, that is, the Grundlegung zur Metaphysik der Sitten, and the reader will please understand that all the page numbers given by themselves refer to it. Both the other works will only be considered as accessory and secondary. For a proper comprehension of the present criticism, which, in probing the Kantian ethics to its depths, bears directly and principally on this Grundlegung, it is very desirable that the latter be carefully read through again, so that the mind may have a perfectly clear and fresh presentment of what it contains. It is but a matter of 128 and 14 pages. I shall quote from the third edition of 1792, adding the page number of the new complete publication by Rosenkranz with an R prefixed. Chapter 2. On the imperative form of the Kantian ethics. Kant's proton pseudos, or first false step, lies in his conception of ethics itself, and this is found very clearly expressed on page 62. Quote, "In a system of practical philosophy we are not concerned with adducing reasons for that which takes place, but with formulating laws regarding that which ought to take place, even if it never does take place." End quote. This is at once a distinct petitio principii. Who tells you that there are laws to which our conduct ought to be subject? Who tells you that that ought to take place, which in fact never does take place? What justification have you for making this assumption at the outset, and consequently for forcing upon us, as the only possible one, a system of ethics couched in the imperative terms of legislation? I say, in contradistinction to Kant, that the student of ethics, and no less the philosopher in general, must content himself with explaining and interpreting that which is given, in other words, that which really is or takes place, so as to obtain an understanding of it, and I maintain furthermore that there is plenty to do in this direction, much more than has hitherto been done, after the lapse of thousands of years. Following the above petitio principii, Kant straightway, without any previous investigation, assumes in the preface, which is entirely devoted to the subject, that purely moral laws exist, and this assumption remains thenceforth undisturbed, and forms the very foundation of his whole system. We, however, prefer first of all to examine the conception denoted by the word law. The true and original meaning of the term is limited to law as between citizens. It is the lex, nomos of the Romans and Greeks, a human institution, and depending on human volition. It has a secondary derived figurative metaphorical meaning when applied to nature, whose operations, partly known a priori, partly learnt by experience, and which are always constant, we call natural laws. Only a very small portion of these natural laws can be discerned a priori, and with admirable acuteness Kant set them apart, and classed them under the name Metaphysics of Nature. There is also undoubtedly a law for the human will, in so far as man belongs to nature, and this law is strictly provable, admits of no exception, and is inviolable and immovable as the mountains, and does not, like the categorical imperative, imply a quasi-necessity, but rather a complete and absolute one. It is the law of motivation, a form of the law of causation. In other words, it is the causation which is brought about by the medium of the understanding. It is the sole demonstrable law to which the human will as such is subject. It means that every action can only take place in consequence of a sufficient motive. Like causality in general, it is a natural law. On the other hand, moral laws, apart from human institution, state ordinance, or religious doctrine, cannot rightly be assumed as existing without proof. Kant, therefore, by taking such laws for granted, is guilty of a petitio principii, which is all the bolder in that he at once adds, page 6 of the preface, that a moral law ought to imply absolute necessity, but absolute necessity is everywhere characterized by an inevitable chain of consequence. How, then, can such a conception be attached to these alleged moral laws, as an instance of which he adduces, quote, "Thou shalt not lie"? End quote. Everyone knows, and he himself admits, that no such consecution for the most part takes place. The reverse, indeed, is the rule. In scientific ethics, before we admit as controlling the will other laws besides that of motivation, laws which are original and independent of all human ordinance, we must first prove and deduce their existence. That is, provided in things ethical we are concerned not merely with recommending honesty, but with practicing it. Until that proof be furnished, I shall recognize only one source to which is traceable the importation into ethics of the conception law, precept, obligation. It is one which is foreign to philosophy. I mean the Mosaic Decalogue. Indeed, the spelling "du sollt" in the above instance of a moral law, the first put forward by Kant, naively betrays this origin. A conception, however, which can point to no other source than this, has no right, without undergoing further scrutiny, thus to force its way into philosophical ethics. It will be rejected until introduced by duly accredited proof. Thus on the threshold of the subject Kant makes his first petitio principii, and that no small one. Our philosopher, then, by begging the question in his preface, simply assumes the conception of moral law as given and existing beyond all doubt, and he treats the closely related conception of duty exactly in the same way. Without subjecting it to any further test, he admits it forthwith as a proper appurtenance of ethics. But here again I am compelled to enter a protest. This conception, equally with the kindred notions of law, command, obligation, etc., taken thus unconditionally, has its source in theological morals, and it will remain a stranger to philosophical morals so long as it fails to furnish sufficient credentials drawn either from man's nature or from the objective world. Till then, I can only recognize the Decalogue as the origin of all these connected conceptions. Since the rise of Christianity, there is no doubt that philosophical has been unconsciously molded by theological ethics, and since the latter is essentially dictatorial, the former appears in the shape of precepts and inculcation of duty, in all innocence and without any suspicion that first an ulterior sanction is needed for this role. Rather does she suppose it to be her proper and natural form. It is true that all peoples, ages, and creeds, and indeed all philosophers, with the exception of the materialists proper, have undeniably recognized that the ethical significance of human conduct is a metaphysical one, in other words, that it stretches out beyond this phenomenal existence and reaches to eternity. But it is equally true that the presentment of this fact in terms of command and obedience, of law and duty, is no part of its essence. Furthermore, separated from the theological hypotheses whence they have sprung, these conceptions lose in reality all meaning, and to attempt to substitute for the former by talking with Kant of absolute obligation and of unconditioned duty is to feed the reader with empty words, nay more, is to give him a contradictio in adjecto to digest. Every obligation derives all sense and meaning simply and solely from its relation to threatened punishment or promised reward. Hence, long before Kant was thought of, Locke says, quote, "For since it would be utterly in vain to suppose a rule set to the free actions of man, without annexing to it some enforcement of good and evil to determine his will, we must, wherever we suppose a law, suppose also some reward or punishment annexed to that law." End quote. What ought to be done is therefore necessarily conditioned by punishment or reward. Consequently, to use Kant's language, it is essentially and inevitably hypothetical, and never, as he maintains, categorical. If we think away these conditions, the conception of obligation becomes void of sense. Hence absolute obligation is most certainly a contradictio in adjecto. A commanding voice, whether it come from within or from without, cannot possibly be imagined except as threatening or promising. Consequently, obedience to it, which may be wise or foolish according to circumstances, is yet always actuated by selfishness, and therefore morally worthless. The complete unthinkableness and nonsense of this conception of an unconditioned obligation, which lies at the root of the Kantian ethics, appears later in the system itself, namely in the Kritik der praktischen Vernunft. Just as some concealed poison in an organism cannot remain hid, but sooner or later must come out and show itself. For this obligation, said to be so unconditioned, nevertheless postulates more than one condition in the background. It assumes a rewarder, a reward, and the immortality of the person to be rewarded. This is of course unavoidable if one really makes duty and obligation the fundamental conception of ethics, for these ideas are essentially relative and depend for their significance on the threatened penalty or the promised reward. The guerdon which is assumed to be in store for virtue shows clearly enough that only in appearance she works for nothing. It is, however, put forward modestly veiled, under the name of the highest good, which is the union of virtue and happiness. But this is at bottom nothing else but a morality that derives its origin from happiness, which means a morality resting on selfishness. In other words, it is eudaimonism, which Kant had solemnly thrust out of the front door of his system as an intruder, only to let it creep in again by the postern under the name of the highest good. This is how the assumption of unconditioned absolute obligation, concealing as it does a contradiction, avenges itself. Conditioned obligation, on the other hand, cannot of course be any first principle for ethics, since everything done out of regard for reward or punishment is necessarily an egoistic transaction, and as such is without any real moral value. All this makes it clear that a nobler and wider view of ethics is needed, if we are in earnest about our endeavor to truly account for the significance of human conduct, a significance which extends beyond phenomena and is eternal. As all obligation is entirely dependent on a condition, so also is all duty. Both conceptions are very closely related, indeed almost identical. The only difference between them might be said to be that obligation in general may rest on mere force, whereas duty involves the sense of obligation deliberately undertaken, such as we see between master and servant, principal and subordinate, rulers and the ruled. And since no one undertakes a duty gratis, every duty implies also a right. The slave has no duties, because he has no rights, but he is subject to an obligation which rests on sheer force. In the following part I shall explain the only meaning which the conception duty has in ethics. If we put ethics in an imperative form, making it a doctrine of duties, and regard the moral worth or worthlessness of human conduct as the fulfillment or violation of duties, we must remember that this view of duty and of obligation in general is undeniably derived solely from theological morals and primarily from the Decalogue, and consequently that it rests essentially and inseparably on the assumption of man's dependence on another will which gives him commands and announces reward or punishment. But the more the assumption of such a will is in theology positive and precise, the less should it be quietly and unsuspectingly introduced into philosophical morals. Hence we have no right to assume beforehand that for the latter the imperative form, the ordaining of commands, laws, and duties is an essential and a matter of course. And it is a very poor shift to substitute the word absolute or categorical for the external condition which is indissolubly attached to such conceptions by their very nature, for this gives rise, as explained above, to a contradictio in adjecto. Kant, then, without more ado or any close examination, borrowed this imperative form of ethics from theological morals. The hypotheses of the latter, in other words theology, really lie at the root of his system, and as these alone in point of fact lend it any meaning or sense, so they cannot be separated from, indeed are implicitly contained in, it. After this, when he had expounded his position, the task of developing in turn a theology out of his morals, the famous Moral Theologie, was easy enough, for the conceptions which are implicitly involved in his imperative and which lie hidden at the base of his morals only required to be brought forward and expressed explicitly as postulates of practical reason. And so it was that, to the world's great edification, a theology appeared depending simply on ethics, indeed actually derived therefrom. But this came about because the ethical system itself rests on concealed theological hypotheses. I mean no derisive comparison, but in its form the process is analogous to that whereby a conjurer prepares a surprise for us, when he lets us find something where he had previously employed his art to place it. Described in the abstract, Kant's procedure is this. What ought to have been his first principle, or hypothesis, that is, theology, he made the conclusion, and what ought to have been deduced as the conclusion, that is, the categorical command, he took as his hypothesis. But after he had thus turned the thing upside down, nobody, not even he himself, recognized it as being what it really was, namely, the old well-known system of theological morals. How this trick was accomplished we shall consider in the 6th and 7th chapters of the present part. Ethics was of course frequently put in the imperative form, and treated as a doctrine of duties also in pre-Kantian philosophy, but it was always then based upon the will of a God whose existence had been otherwise proved, and so there was no inconsequence. As soon, however, as the attempt was made, as Kant attempted, to give a foundation to ethics independent of this will, and establish it without metaphysical hypotheses, there was no longer any justification for taking as its basis the words, "thou shalt," and "it is thy duty," that is, the imperative form, without first deducing the truth thereof from some other source.
End of section 2.